Hi, my name is Lisa Bustos, and I am the owner and founder of Bustos Family Law, where I've been helping couples all over the state of Texas with their prenuptial agreements for over 10 years. As someone who works with individuals all over the state of Texas with their prenuptial agreements, a lot of them come to me and they have questions about the process or about what a prenuptial agreement should include or what it can include. There's really not a lot of information about prenuptial agreements that's out there already. So the purpose of this video is to kind of help answer those questions and demystify some of that process. One of the first questions that I get asked is who should get a prenup? I have a short list here of people who should consider getting a prenuptial agreement, but some of those people might include people who were previously married, if they have property from their first marriage or before the marriage that they have, that's their separate property. They really want to delineate what is theirs and what is not going to be community property or what some people call marital property. People who have children from previous relationships, they might want to have a very, very clear delineation of what belongs to them, because for estate planning purposes, it needs to be very clear that certain property is going to be going to their children or to their future or second or third spouse, a combination of the two of those. It's very helpful to have clear ownership rules so that there's not any kind of contention later on down the line. People who own any kind of property or hope to own any kind of property, prenuptial agreements won't only protect the property that you have now, it can also include protections for future property that you will acquire in the future. And people who have any debts or student loans, this can help courts and if there's any kind of estate planning or probate courts or divorce courts, it can help those courts or just individuals understand what property is going to be theirs, what debt's going to be theirs, and what they're going to be responsible for. And lastly, a prenuptial agreement can fit anybody's circumstances because, oddly enough, if you live in the state of Texas, you probably are going to own some kind of property or some kind of debt in your name, whether that's a bank account or personal property. It's something that's going to be owned by everyone. So it's really helpful to have a prenuptial agreement that delineates what belongs to which person in the marriage. So one of the main things that you need to know is that Texas is a community property state. That means that after you're married, all property as a default that is acquired after marriage, whether that is a house or personal property or your income, your paycheck, that's going to be community property, and that's going to be owned by both people in the marriage equally, or at least somewhat equally. Separate property is protected by the Texas Constitution, and separate property is generally, there are some exceptions to this, but separate property are things that are owned before the marriage. That could be your 401k, it can be bank accounts, it could be cars, it could be houses, and anything that's acquired after the marriage, either by inheritance or by gift. Something that you really, really need to know is that Texas courts favor upholding prenuptial agreements. So if you have one, you really need to make sure that it is covering everything that you want to cover and that you truly understand the prenuptial agreement and what it covers, because unfortunately you might be in a prenuptial agreement that you may not agree with once it comes down to a divorce or estate planning, and you either need to make changes later or it's too late to make changes and you just have to live with what you have. Now, I've given you the general rules of community property and separate property, and the reason why is because the biggest decision that you need to make in starting a prenuptial agreement or going through the prenuptial agreement process is whether or not you want to create a community estate at all. Now, again, anything that is acquired after the marriage is going to be owned by both parties. That does not matter if it's only in one person's name. Some people come to me in a divorce case and they'll say, we never combined our accounts. Everything's been only in my name or my spouse's name, and that's it. And guess what? That doesn't really matter because it's all jointly owned. So with a prenuptial agreement, you guys can say, hey, anything that's only in my name is going to stay only in my name and it's only going to belong to me, and same to my spouse. My recommendation overall, and whatever rule scheme that you're coming up with for a prenuptial agreement, is that you keep it simple. As a divorce attorney, one of the things that is that people find the most difficult about prenuptial agreements is actually following them and applying it to their marriage, because people who end up married, for a very, very long time, they actually kind of forget about the prenuptial agreement and they start making side deals, off the record or, in text messages and things like that. And then all of a sudden, when it comes down to it and you actually have to use a prenuptial agreement, those are the rules that you have to follow, and the side rules that you may have made up they won't apply unless you guys agree otherwise. So what can I include in my prenup? You can determine custom rules for characterizing property during the marriage. Like I said, you can decide not to create a community estate at all, or you can decide, hey, things that we buy jointly, they're going to be community, or they're going to be owned. If we buy something jointly, on the alternative, they're going to be owned equally with each other as our own individual separate property ownership proportion. That could be equal. It could be a proportion of who contributes what. So if one person contributes 80%, they own it 80%. If one person, contributes more or less, that might be helpful to make people feel like they are getting what they're investing. Another thing is that you can determine whether there will be spousal support, and if so, the terms for that support. This is really helpful if you have a spouse that is going to be a stay-at-home parent, and you're creating a separate property structured scheme within your prenuptial agreement, so there won't be community property. Sometimes people have terms for spousal support, whether that's a lump sum buyout in the event of a divorce, or it could be a tiered structure. Sometimes we will also include that, there are retirement accounts that will need to be contributed from one spouse to the other, so that the spouse who is staying home can actually build up an estate of their own during the marriage. That's sometimes helpful, just so that, in the event that the spouse who is staying at home can actually have some kind of protection or property and they're not being left high and dry. You can also determine how expenses will be paid during the marriage. A lot of prenuptial agreements will have terms for household accounts that will say, hey, these bills, the common everyday bills, are going to be paid out of this household account, and here's how the contribution is going to work. A lot of times we put things by agreement. Sometimes people will have a very structured scheme to it, but you guys can have that discussion before you actually get married, so that you will have a clear understanding about what the expectations are before you actually start your marriage process. So other things you can include in your prenup, you can determine dispute resolution methods. Some of those things are marriage counseling. If you guys aren't, aren't ready for divorce, but you have hit a really big conflict. Conflict is something that's very common in marriage. It happens to everybody. You guys might want to try marriage counseling and say, hey, we have this prenuptial agreement where we said that if we have, major conflict, we're going to try marriage counseling first. Another common, if you actually move towards divorce, you can try arbitration. Arbitration is something that will keep your divorce out of the public court system from a trial perspective, and it will go to a private arbitrator who will make decisions as to how things will be divided in your divorce. And then a lot of times people do mediation either before arbitration or in lieu of arbitration in the event of divorce. And that means that people go to a third-party mediator, and they have that mediator help them come out with a negotiated deal that will determine how things will be divided in their divorce. One of the important things to differentiate between arbitration and mediation is that an arbitrator makes a decision in arbitration, and in mediation, the parties make a decision. The mediator just helps facilitate the negotiations. A common question I get asked about prenuptial agreements is if there will be a cheating clause and what that looks like. So you can determine if and how a cheating clause will impact property division. One of the things that is pretty tricky about cheating clauses is that you need to define cheating. And people have different definitions of what that is. So that's something a lawyer can help structure. However, is also something that you need to maybe have a conversation with yourself and with your partner about what this looks like, so that you guys can have a clear understanding moving forward. And then I've mentioned estate planning in this video already, but one of the things that you can do is you can create a roadmap for future estate planning. Because Texas is a separate property state, an estate planner will want to know if there is separate property. Having a prenuptial agreement is really helpful, because a lot of estate planners ask, hey, can you send me the prenup? And the reason they ask for that is because it clearly delineates what is theirs and what is separate property and what is community property, and it makes that process go a lot smoother. Some of the things that are not allowed in a prenup. By Texas law, you are not allowed to include anything illegal in a prenup. You cannot include anything that impacts child custody. So any visitation schedules, any geographic restrictions, any rights and duties. You can't include anything related to that. You also cannot include anything negatively impacting child support. So you cannot say, hey, if I give my spouse $20,000 in spousal support, I'm not going to pay child support. A court will not uphold that, and a court will not respect that. This is considered a violation of public policy of the state of Texas. So we're just not going to include that. You can, however, include provisions that positively impact child support. So, for example, in the state of Texas, you cannot be ordered to pay college tuition for a child that is an adult. One of the things you can include in a prenup is that, hey, the spouse is going to, should the parties divorce, one spouse is going to pay the college tuition of the children, and that can include stepchildren as well. So that's something to consider as you're negotiating your prenuptial agreement and as you're discussing the terms of what that might look like. So anything that violating the public policy of Texas, that's kind of a broad sweep of things, and I think it just gives the courts the ability to say, hey, this is really not great, and it's outside of the normal prenup norms. So we're not going to apply it because it violates public policy. Will my prenup hold up in court? The answer is yes. Courts highly, highly value upholding prenuptial agreements. Some lawyers disagree with us. I have read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases in Texas courts, and I can tell you, with high certainty, a court is going to uphold your prenuptial agreement. And that is a very good thing, but it's also a dangerous thing. If you have a prenuptial agreement, again, that you don't understand, a prenuptial agreement that doesn't cover all the terms, all the bases, you can end up in a divorce court and find out that the prenuptial agreement that you thought you had is a lot different in application in divorce court. So please talk to a divorce lawyer when you're considering a prenuptial agreement, because they will be able to guide you and tell you how it will actually work in divorce courts. Property in Texas is not very straightforward, even though I've given you a very simplified version of community property and separate property. There are things that can change from community property and separate property. There can be mutations, there can be growths, there can be waste claims, there can be reimbursement claims, there can be all sorts of things that will change the structure and characterization of property, and different legal disputes that can come into play that you can deal with directly in a prenuptial agreement. Well, some prenuptial agreements do include and some do not. So just be aware of that as you are, talking to attorneys. You really want someone who has read a lot of case law, who has tried cases, who has mediated cases, who's practiced divorce law before, so that how your prenuptial agreement is going to hold up. So with that is my prenuptial agreement presentation for you. Thank you for listening to me, and let's work together. Feel free to reach out to me. I have a lot of other videos about little questions that I get commonly asked on my YouTube shorts, as well as on my other social medias like Instagram, Facebook. Follow us along, and we will look forward to working with you. Thanks.